Okay, in this video we're going to be talking about the Data tab. And the Data tab is a really important one because it's where you get data from other sources. It's also where you do queries to connect to data and a whole bunch of other things. And the Data tab is right over here to the right of Formulas. We'll click on that. And you can see we have our section of Get and Transform Data. We have Queries and Connections. We have Sort and Filter. We have Data Tools. We have Forecast. And we have Outline. So let's dive right into Get and Transform Data. In previous versions of Excel, this section would be found in an add-in called Power Query. But in 2016, it's integrated right into the main software. And even within Excel 2016 versions, the Data tab on some versions will look different than others. For instance, you can see mine has the Get Data drop-down over here, but many will have a new query button somewhere in here instead. And in fact, I'll show you an example of what that might look like. This is just a screenshot of what yours might look like. You can see it's got the Get External Data tab, and then it has a new query button here, which is where you would go to create a new query or get new data. And you can see it has different options like from a file, from a database, like an Access database, from Azure, and so on. But if yours looks more like this, then just know that yours will be in a little different place, but it's still basically the same tools, okay? So the way that my version and a lot of other versions will look is that you'll have the Get and Transform Data group here on the left, and you'll primarily get your data or import your data using this button here. So let's just dive in and I'll walk you through how to use this. So when you click it, it gives you a drop down and you have quite a few options. You can do it from a file, and you can see you have the options of from workbook, from text or CSV file, from XML, from a JSON file, or as the founder of JSON likes to pronounce it jokingly, JSON, or from a folder. And we'll look at one or two of these in just a minute, but let me go through the rest of the drop down here. After file, we have from database. So we have from SQL Server, some people say SQL Server, from Microsoft Access Database, from Analysis Services, or from SQL Server Analysis Services Database. We'll look at how to do a Microsoft Access database in just a little bit as well. Then from online services, again, some versions will be a little different. Yours might have Azure or from SharePoint. In this case, it just lists Facebook. Okay, and we won't go into that because basically you're just logging into Facebook to create a connection and import data. And then from other sources. So you can go from a table or range. You can do a query from the web. So if you have data that's arranged in a table format, or even if it's not for that matter, but on a website, you can do this using just the URL. You can do a Microsoft query. You can do OData, ODBC, OLEDB, or a blank query where you write one from scratch. We won't get into these, but this is so you know where they are should you need them. Okay, you can combine queries by merging or appending queries. You can launch the query editor. That's a really important one. So remember, if you need to get into the query editor, it's under your Get Data tab, or it may be under your New Query tab, depending on your version. But it's the Launch Query Editor. We'll get into this tool quite a bit in this lecture because it's really important to be able to edit your queries as you create them, because that's part of the power of the Get and Transform feature in Excel. You can modify your data source settings, basically changing the location of the source of your data, or you can modify your query options. So let's just go up to the top here and go to From File, and we're going to go ahead and go to From Text or CSV. So what we're doing when we use the Get and Transform feature in Excel is we're creating a connection to a data source. Well, technically we're creating a query. So we're setting up some criteria so that when we connect to that data, we can have it behave the way that we want to every time it comes in. And we can refresh the data so that it stays current in our Excel workbook. So if you're downloading or importing data from another source frequently, this can be a huge time saver. So let's go ahead and click on From Text or CSV. And I'm just going to import this employees table. And you'll see that it brings up a little dialog box with a preview here. It's just got some options for our file origin. We're just going to leave that on the Windows default. It lays out a delimiter where this is a text file and it's a CSV. That means comma separated values file. That means that our info is divided by commas. And if we tell Excel that it's divided by commas, then it will break those pieces of information into columns. But you can choose different delimiters if that's appropriate. And then data type detection, you can say based on first 200 rows or on entire data set, or tell it to do not detect data types. But you usually want to do first 200 rows or entire data set. Okay, we'll leave it at that. And then this is your preview. And you have a couple of options here. You can just click the load button, in which case it will drop it right into my spreadsheet. You can use the little drop down here and say load to, and it'll give you all kinds of options. You can load it to a table, a pivot table report, a pivot chart, or you can just create the connection to this data but not actually load it into your worksheet. You can put it in the existing worksheet and choose a location, or you can create a new worksheet. You can also select add this data to the data model. A data model is basically when you create a relational data set in Excel. It's sort of like an Access database, but it allows you to connect and relate multiple tables and data sources to each other. Okay, so we could just set it up like this and then click OK. And in fact, I'll show you what that looks like. The first thing you'll notice is this Queries and Connections window pops up, and it has our employees table in there under the one query. Shows how many rows we have loaded, and if we click on this, it'll give us a preview and some options. We can view it in a worksheet, edit it, or delete it. And then you'll also notice that it loaded our information into a worksheet, and it formatted as a table. So if I were to go to this original file and I were to delete out these last three names here and save it, within Excel here I could go and click refresh, and it would recognize that the original file was missing these three, and it would delete them, because we now have a query that is going to that original source, that text file or CSV file, and pulling fresh data from that source. Okay, so that's part of the importance of having these connections. So let's jump back into the data tab, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this connection so I can show you some other ways to do it. And I'm going to delete this sheet. Okay, so that was if you just load it straight in. Let's try a different way. So we're going to go to From File, From Text or CSV, Employees Table. Here we have our previewer again. That was our load and our load to options. Now let's try the edit option. When we click on that, it's going to bring us to the query editor. Now, the query editor is really cool, and it's really important to know a few things about it. You can see it looks like its own piece of software, really. It has its own ribbon. It has 4 different tabs, all with their own tools. And it even has the file tab, 5 tabs. But it's a pretty involved and sophisticated editor so that we can modify the way these behave when we import them. So if you are completely happy with this exactly how it is, you could go ahead and say close and load, do the drop down and say either close and load, it'll load it right into your current worksheet, or you can say close and load to, just like we did before, and it will give you some options for where you want to put it. But let's go back into that, because we're not going to do it that way this time. We're going to go back into edit, open up our query editor, and we're going to look at some of these other options here. So you can rename it in the properties. So if I just want to call this employees, just delete that. You can do a description. You'll notice that changes the name over here. You can also get to the properties by clicking on that one. You can refresh the preview, or you can refresh all the data. There's nothing to refresh here, so we won't do that. We won't get into the advanced editor or the manage tab. You have the options of deleting and duplicating it through here. But let's get into some of these cool tools over here. Well, actually, first let's look at this table right here. This is just basically your Excel spreadsheet. You can see your row numbers down here. We have our columns across the top. Notice it's just given these default names of column 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we have these little symbols along here. This is ABC. If I click on that, you'll notice that these are all different format types. So ABC stands for text. So it recognizes that these are text. This one's the same. It recognizes that they're text. This one sees the phone numbers and calls them text. And it's up to you whether you want to consider phone numbers text or numbers. And then this one has office numbers, and those are formatted as numbers. So you 1, 2, 3, if we go to there, you see that the 1, 2, 3 stands for a whole number. So it automatically formatted them how we want. If you want to change them, you can just go in and click and change them however you want. You can click into these and rename them. So we'll call this first. Click into this one and call it last. Click into this one and call it phone. There we go. And let's say we don't want column 4. We can just click on it, and we can either right click and say remove, or we can click on it and just go up to remove columns. And you'll notice it gives you two choices on the drop down. You can either remove the columns that are selected, or you can remove the other columns. So if we wanted to delete all 3 of these, we would select on this one and then click remove other columns. But we just want to delete the one that we have highlighted here, because these are office numbers that don't really apply to this say phone number list that we're trying to create. So we can just click remove columns, and that one went away. If you have tons and tons and tons of columns, say 20 or 30 or whatever, you can go to this option and you can go to choose columns. It's going to bring up another drop down, and you see it's got a list of our columns here. So you can select columns using this, which is sometimes quicker if you have a ton of columns, and you can also search by name or whatever the column name is. Okay, we'll cancel out of that. You can choose options with rows. Let's say you wanted to get rid of these last 3 entries, 13, 14, and 15. We can say remove rows. Go to remove bottom rows. It's going to say how many rows do you want to remove? Well, we want to remove the bottom 3, so we hit number of rows, 3. Click OK, and watch 13, 14, and 15 down there. Disappeared. Okay, so that took care of those. You can go to keep rows. Same thing. You can just choose, if you only want to keep the top rows, then you can just keep the top rows, bottom rows, a range of rows, whatever you want to keep. We can sort here, so let's go to last name. We can click here to sort. We can sort by ascending. Notice that these are not in alphabetical order. Click sort ascending. Now they're in alphabetical order. You can also click here to do the same thing. We can sort it backwards, put it back to ascending. So what we're doing here is we're creating these actions that every time that we import this, or every time we refresh this data in Excel, it's going to go through this query. So in other words, this query editor is going to make these changes to it. It's going to delete the last column. It's going to delete the last 3 rows. It's going to alphabetize everything by last name. It's going to do all of this before it drops it into Excel, so that we don't have to do it every time. So we don't have to do all this formatting basically and arranging and deleting and adding as we're importing this data. Okay, so that's what's really cool about it. Split column. So this is pretty cool. Let's say that the Joe Barnett, all these names were in one column. So it said Joe Barnett, Stu Bishop, Bob Blake, etc. We could simply select on this, go to split column, and you can choose by delimiter or by number of characters. So if there was a space between Joe and Barnett, we could go by delimiter and we could choose space. And you say the leftmost delimiter. So it's looking for the first space. And then when we click OK, it'll divide it up into two separate columns with the first name in one and the last name in the other. This is already divided, so it wouldn't do anything. So I'm going to click cancel. But that's how you use the split column. You can group them based on certain values. That doesn't really apply to this table. Okay, you can change the data type. Again, all of these are text, but if I selected on that and I wanted to change the data type to number, currency, whole number, date and time, whatever, I can change that here, and then it will be reflected in that little icon there. You can use the first row as headers. This one doesn't have headers, but if the information that I brought in from this CSV file had said first, last, and phone on the first row, then I could just click on this and it would promote them to headers, see? And I didn't actually mean to click on that button, but when I did, see, it promoted the first row to headers. Now it says Joe Barnett and his phone number. Well, I don't want that. So I can fix that. You can't Control Z in the query editor to undo things. There's no undo button up here either. But you can change the steps over here. So you see all of our steps are here. We found our source. We changed the type of information we were getting. We renamed our columns. We removed the bottom rows. We sorted the rows alphabetically by last name. And then we promoted Joe Barnett to the headers. Well, we don't want that to happen, so we're going to go ahead and click on the red X and delete that. Notice it puts Joe back into the table and puts our headers back. Okay, so this is important to know. You can change the steps that you've applied over in here. If we don't want to remove that last column with their office numbers, I can just click the red X here and we'll go ahead and click delete. You notice it gave me that warning saying, you know, if you delete this step, it might mess up what you've done after that. So make sure that you're not going to mess up other actions. But in this case, it was fine. So that's use first row as headers. You can replace values. So let's say that these phone numbers are incorrect. Let's say this 555 prefix was supposed to be 395 all the way down here, okay? Then we go ahead and go to replace values. Oh wait, we don't want to do it down there. We want to do it at the end. Make sure we're selected on the end. Now let's try replace values. It says replace one value with another in this selected column. So value defined. Oh, let me move this. Okay, so we're going to take 555 and we're going to replace it with 395. Click OK. And presto, it changed it to 395. Okay? And then you'll see it also added that step. So that's how you replace a value. We can do combine. So we can merge multiple queries or append queries. If you merge queries, you'll go and bring in another query. We don't have another query in here, but if I did, then it would show a preview of the second query as well. This is our first query. It would show a preview of our second query, and then we could go and select how we want to join them, or our join kind. And these are different options for how you want those two queries to relate to each other and match up. Okay? We'll cancel out of that. Manage parameters, we won't go into that, but you can view and modify your parameters there. Data source settings, so you can manage your permissions, edit permissions, change your data sources, and so on in this pop-up. You can get new sources, you could go to recent sources. That's just to create a new query. And then as we said over here, you can modify the name, you can modify the properties, or modify the steps. Okay, so that's all the time we have for this video. In the next video, we'll look at these other tabs in the ribbon of the query editor, and we'll continue looking at the other elements of the data tab in the Excel ribbon.